G'day, guys, and welcome to episode 5 of the Mindful Men podcast. My name is Simon Rennie, and I'm the man behind Mindful Men. Today's episode is all about obsessive compulsive disorder, or what's called OCD. Now, I mentioned last week that this episode is a biggie, and that's because OCD has been in my life longer than depression and anxiety. I've also got a lot to say about OCD because it is such a misunderstood disorder. So bear with me as I shed some light on the complexities that make OCD so hard to live with. And in doing so, I hope to do something that is important for many of us in the OCD community. I hope to dispel the myth that OCD is just a personality quirk. Take it from me. Take it from someone who has lived with OCD for over 20 years. OCD isn't just about wanting to have clean hands or having our homes, work, or school spaces neat and tidy. It isn't about ensuring our emails or reports that we write have full stops at the end of each sentence, because that's just basic grammar. It's much more than that. It's debilitating. It's time consuming. It impacts the way we think and feel and express ourselves. And this is important because OCD is often joked about. The number of times I've sat in a work meeting to hear someone say, "Oh, my OCD is killing me because this report has a typo." Or, "I'm so OCD because I like my pens to be lined up on my desk just right." Or even a new one I heard recently that suggested people with OCD liked COVID because it meant we're all cleaning our hands. Whilst everyone starts laughing about these jokes, I sit back and wonder if they've actually ever experienced OCD, or if they've ever known someone who lives with OCD, or even if they know what OCD stands for. And if they did, I doubt that they would be joking about it. And this is not to say that people with OCD don't act out some of these things. And in fact, my OCD has elements of these things too. But it's not because I like things neat and tidy or clean. It's much more profound than that. And I'll give you some examples of my OCD later on. OCD is often called a silent condition. It's a silent disease or a silent disorder. And people living with it tend to suffer in silence because of how unsettling it can be. It can bring about huge shame, guilt, fear, anxiety, and depression. And it can be damn hard to talk about because it involves thought cycles that are extremely distressing. Speaking up about OCD brings about fear, and we fear that by saying what's on our minds, we'll be judged. We fear we'll be arrested. We fear that we'll lose everything we have when we talk about what's going on inside. And it's this fear that keeps many of us from seeking help. In fact, so many don't, but the ones that do, well, on average, it takes about 17 years for us to get our first lot of treatment. That's 17 years from first symptom to first treatment. And I can certainly attest to that. It took me over 20 years to open up and start talking about my mental illness. And to be honest with you, I was completely surprised when the psychologist told me I had OCD. For sure, depression was a given. Anxiety was an extra. But OCD was a complete surprise. I was like, what the hell is OCD? Well, in this episode, let me help you understand it. Now, like the last few episodes, I'll throw some numbers at you to provide some context to OCD. And by talking about the numbers, I hope to highlight for all those suffering in silence that they're not doing this alone. I'll talk about what OCD actually is and a few different types of OCD. I'll shed some light on diagnosis, and I can guarantee you that it doesn't include anything about thinking or feeling a little OCD. Then I'll share my story with the same hope that inspires other boys, men, and OCD sufferers to tell theirs. So, what is OCD? Well, let's start with the O. The O stands for obsessive. It's an obsession. It's a thought, an idea, or a sensation. It's kind of like an intrusive thought, the type of thought that floats into our brain, scares the hell out of us, then leaves. And the majority of us get them, and for the most part, they don't cause distress. Sure, we may notice them and wonder why we're thinking the way we are, but they tend to leave pretty quick. We don't give them any more thought. But unlike these intrusive thoughts, the obsession for someone living with OCD sticks around, and we focus in on them. And in many cases, we recognize that they're actually pretty outrageous. They're silly or stupid or make no sense whatsoever. But no matter how hard we try to let the thoughts or ideas or sensations go, or even try to ignore them or tell ourselves that they're not real, they stick around. And they stick around until we cave in and do a compulsion. Now, there's a whole range of different types of obsessions that people experience, and they are unique to each individual. Just because I have obsessions about things like safety or security, it doesn't mean the next person living with OCD will. So, some common obsessions include things like contamination from body fluids or chemicals or dirt, germs, and disease. It could be losing control of our thoughts, like, thinking about hurting someone even though we don't want to. It could be being responsible for harming someone through inadvertent actions. And this one is kind of like if you dropped a banana peel on the ground, which someone might slip on and they might get hurt. They're also maintaining perfectionism, including fear of losing things or knowledge or information that we might need later on. And it can relate to the need to maintain symmetry or even routine to excessive levels. There's also ones about unwanted sexual thoughts that are perverse or taboo and totally against our nature. Someone experiencing OCD may have one of these types of obsessions, or they might have a few. But a key point here is that they don't want the obsession. They think or feel it, but they don't want it. And they don't act on it, and they don't want to act on it. And it often makes them question their own morality. It makes them worry that their thoughts are defining them, that they're turning into their thoughts and maybe losing control of the person that they actually know they are. Obsessions come into play at various trigger points of the day. It could be when we first get up in the morning, or when we park our car on a hill, or it could be when we go to a restaurant or a public toilet. It could be in the shower or last thing before jumping into bed at night. And it's unique to the person, as I said before, and the context of which the trigger occurs. So, in order to alleviate the distress that comes from obsessions, the person needs to complete a compulsive act or a compulsion. This is the C of OCD. And it's the need to perform an act over and over again for various reasons. It could be to alleviate the distress caused by the obsession, or maybe to prevent the obsession from coming true, or even to prevent the obsession from occurring in the first place. Compulsions are time-consuming. They can be ritualistic in nature, exhausting, and even torturous. Some examples of common compulsions include washing and cleaning to an excessive level. Could be checking things to ensure that nothing bad might happen or has happened because we haven't checked something. And this one can include checking with people for the same reasons. Could be repeating routines, including doing things in multiples, like doing a task 3 times to make sure it's done just right. It can involve physical touch or tapping or moving in certain ways, or even performing mental compulsions like counting, saying particular words in our minds, and praying. Now, I've only touched briefly on a few obsessions, compulsions, and there are many more out there. But I hope by now you can start to see that it's a lot more complex than just having clean hands or our pens in order on our desk because we just like it that way. It's an obsession followed by a compulsion. And it's distressing, time-consuming, and outright torture. So, now that we know what OCD is, how many of us are impacted by it? Well, The data on OCD is a little bit more difficult to find when you compare it to, say, anxiety or depression. But from the data that is available, it points to about 500,000 Australians living with OCD. Now, this doesn't seem like many when you consider the total population is about 25 million. But for one person living with OCD, I dare say that the impacts of the condition are felt by many more around them. And I'll share some insight into this with my story in a minute. Now, globally, the available data suggests that between 1.1 to 1.8% of people live with OCD. And as for gender breakdowns, unfortunately, I wasn't able to locate anything concrete or even recent. And the data shortfalls seem to add to this silent disorder. It's not the big ticket mental illness that depression is. It's not as prevalent as anxiety is. When people do talk about it, it's usually as a joke. And when you couple that with how distressing the obsessions and compulsions can be, you can start to see why it takes on average 17 years for OCD sufferers to speak up and seek help. Now, in terms of diagnosis, you don't get it because it's fashionable. You don't get it because you simply like clean hands or things in order. And you certainly don't get it from Dr. Google. So, like I said with depression and anxiety, start with your GP, then get a referral to a psychologist or psychiatrist who can diagnose you. Now, I wanted to highlight that part of the diagnosis about time, and that's how consuming OCD symptoms are. We're talking over an hour per day consumed by obsessions and compulsions. Over an hour every single day. Now, if we take the average years it takes someone to open up about OCD and get help, an hour per day for 17 years equals roughly 6,200 hours. That's 6,200 hours we're trying to figure it out on our own, or 6,200 hours we're trying to hide it from those around us. Imagine doing anything for 6,200 hours, let alone something that you know is irrational, is distressing, disgusting, or just plain weird. But the good thing is that OCD is treatable, and I'll go through some options soon. But before I do, let me give you some insight into how OCD has showed up in my life. Whilst I'm super keen to just rattle off all the OCD quirks that I've had over the years, I'm going to do my best to try and limit them to some key ones. It all started around that year 4 or 5 age of school, with something so innocent as a throwaway line from some kid in the schoolyard. One day, I overheard some kids say that if you didn't speak for more than a minute, you would lose your voice forever. Now, most people on the planet would laugh this off and just go about their lives. But as a young, impressionable kid like me, I took that as a 100% scientifically proven fact. The thought of losing my voice terrified me. How would I communicate? How would I tell jokes or argue with my brothers? The obsessions around this grew and grew, and so I did what I thought I needed to do. I started humming. Why humming? Because I knew it was unrealistic to physically talk constantly, and that would get me in trouble with my teachers. But if I could quietly hum, even for a millisecond, I could escape the wrath of my teachers, but also trick my brain into thinking that I was talking. And then I wouldn't lose my voice. And I did this all day, every day, over and over again. This was my entry into OCD. Fast forward to high school, and I developed obsessions around safety and security. And this represented a fear of harm or losing something, like my property, or something like the house burning down if the stove was left on and something next to it happened to catch fire, or even a murderer got in the house because all the doors and windows weren't locked at night. The onset of this particular obsession also brought about my darkest hours, hours where I wanted it to end. To alleviate the obsession, I would spend hours every night locking up the house before bed. Every window, door, gate, and roller door, even the car would get checked. Then the electricals to make sure that we didn't burn in our sleeps. So I'd check the fridge was closed properly, the oven, stove, or iron were off, and nothing near them would accidentally catch alight. And then when I thought everything was checked just right, I would climb into bed before my mind would tell me that something wasn't just right, and off I go again. Some nights, this would take me hours to do, and I'd be pacing the house or yard as I checked what I needed to check to keep us safe. To be honest with you, these behaviors even stick around until this very day. As an adult, the OCD morphed into other things as well. As I touched on last week with the social drinks at work, OCD will play a huge role in ruminating thoughts. I'll get an obsession that I've somehow offended someone during the social event. And from the offense that I've caused, this is going to result in me getting into a lot of trouble. So, to ensure I hadn't offended anybody, I would rethink every aspect of the event, from when I arrived to drinking a few beers to eating dinner and who I sat with. The trouble with this, however, was that I rethink every aspect so often that the memory of the actual event becomes distorted. And eventually I would lose track of what really happened at all. Now, let me give you one more example from the workplace. It's how OCD impacts my productivity and impacts other people as well. Take something as simple as replying to an email. Most people get an email, they read it once and respond without much thought. I read the email over and over to ensure I understood every aspect, from content to potential tone, and even what isn't written to identify someone's intent. And in 9 out of 10 times, I do this as soon as the email comes in because once it's in my inbox, I just need to know what it says. I then start writing my response. But before I get halfway through, I will reread the original email and then edit my response. Sometimes I would start again and then reread the email and start a new response. Then I reread the email again and my response again. And finally, I eventually send the email. I do all of this in anticipation of the obsession that my response needs to be perfect. And by being perfect, it can't offend the reader. But there's an added catch here. My mind tells me that when I press send, somehow the contents of my response magically change to include offensive language. So to reduce the anxiety, I reread the email and my response another time to make sure. I touch here on perfectionism. My OCD demands it. It demands things to be done just right. And even though perfecting everything causes me great stress and time, I do it because it lessens the anxiety caused by imperfection. And this becomes an example of where my OCD impacts other people. Whilst I'm doing all this perfecting, the person next to me is much more productive. Yet they don't even know I'm doing this. They probably see me as being productive. And there are many times that despite this, I am productive. But I can't help feel frustration and anxiety and fatigue each and every day. And it frustrates the hell out of me, particularly when we're all trying to achieve KPIs. Now, I could go on and on about all the various types of obsessions and compulsions I've had over the years, and I might even share some more in future episodes. But I think the few examples I've given should be enough just to give you a little bit of a taste of what it's like to live with OCD, particularly for me over the last 20 years. And the key thing with most of these examples is that I know they're irrational. I know it as I'm doing it. But often the compulsions have become so automatic that I just do them without thinking. I know the likelihood of my obsessions coming true is very minimal, but the urge to do the compulsion is so great that it overrides the rational part of me. So how have I coped over the years? Well, without meaning to sound like a broken record, I bottled it up. As I mentioned earlier, my OCD diagnosis in 2012 was a complete surprise. But it wasn't until this past year that I actively sought help for my OCD. Why? I'm not sure, but my focus for mental health treatment has always been the depression. I guess I figured that if I cured the depression, the anxiety and OCD would follow, but this has never happened. But last year, when I created Mindful Men and started engaging with the OCD community on Instagram, I started to focus on my own OCD recovery. And it's here that I learned about exposure and response prevention, or ERP. And ERP is often referred to as the gold standard for OCD treatment. So last year, I actively sought a psychologist who I could do this with, and I've seen some great results. Now, I wouldn't say I'm cured because OCD still exists for me, but I can say that I'm a little bit more in control, and I have tools now that can help me to challenge my thoughts and my obsessions, and then reduce the urge I have for the compulsions. On a more basic level, exercise also helps. When I've done some exercise, my mind is more at ease. And when this is the case, the intensity is taken off the OCD and even the anxiety and depression. And whilst it doesn't stop the OCD from happening, it certainly helps make it more manageable. One last thing I've found that's been useful is around developing mindful awareness about my OCD. I'm a firm believer that knowledge provides power, and when we know ourselves more, we can have more control over our actions. By going to therapy with a psychologist experienced with OCD, I was able to develop in-depth knowledge about OCD and how it works. And from this, I was able to become mindful of how it played out inside me. And this helped reassure me that I am not my thoughts, that despite my obsession scaring the hell out of me sometimes, that I'm not going to act on them and become some sort of monster or become some sort of danger to society. I became mindful that by externalizing the internal, by giving voice to these irrational obsessions that come into my mind, I can see them for what they really are. I can see them as just words floating into my mind. They aren't real. They don't define me. I am not my thoughts. Therapy has incorporated a mix of education, cognitive behavior therapy, and ERP, and this is generally where treatment sits for OCD. Medication can also form part of treatment, so a chat with your specialist about this can be useful. It's also important to note that after your initial diagnosis, you don't have to stick with the same psychologist. Social workers and counselors are also great points of contact to work through OCD, but that's providing they have OCD experience or expertise. And this is another key point for treatment. Seek out those with relevant experience. Be picky with who provides you treatment. Don't settle for the provider who has the earliest appointment available but has no OCD experience. Call around and seek out the ones with OCD experience. And if you have to wait a few months, and it's providing that it's safe to wait, then why not wait? After all, on average, you've probably waited over a decade to get help in the first place. So what's a couple more months? Ask to be on cancellation lists and check in periodically to see if you're getting close to the top of that list. And from there, get going with your treatment. Well, that's it for today. Hopefully, I've shed some light on an often misunderstood disorder. Hopefully, I've highlighted that OCD is more than just clean hands and keeping tidy. It's driven by obsessions, and these cause us great distress. And then the compulsions, they hammer the distress in over and over and over again. Now, before I go, I want to ask one huge favor. The next time you're at a social event or work meeting or at school, and you get that urge to say, I'm a little bit OCD or my OCD is killing me, just think about it. Think about what it's actually like to live with OCD. Think about this episode and how OCD can drive us towards wanting life to end. By doing this, we can stop trivializing OCD. We can stop people living with OCD feeling small. We can empower them to speak up and get vulnerable and get help. Because 17 years is too long to wait to get help. Because 6,200 hours is a long time to do something that you know is irrational, you know is distressing, disgusting, or just plain weird. Now, a quick reminder that if you were triggered by anything today, please reach out to your support networks or seek professional help. My name is Simon Rennie, and until next time, stay mindful. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure that you like it and leave a comment, and then share it with your mates. Also, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a moment of future episodes to come.